You are probably familiar with the movie Aladdin, and Aladdin finds this magic lamp, and when he rubs it, this genie comes out, and the genie tells him that he is the most powerful being in the universe, and he's able to grant Aladdin 3 wishes, that Aladdin can wish anything that he wants. There's only limits to these 3 wishes. 1, that he can't wish for more wishes. 2, he can't wish for anybody to fall in love. And 3, he can't wish for anybody to come back from the dead. But outside of those 3 rules, everything else is fair game. There's virtually no limits to what Aladdin can ask for or wish for except for those 3 things. And so Aladdin isn't sure what he wants to wish for at this point, and because there's only 3, and let's be honest, you can't really blame the guy for wanting to be careful, wanting to not waste one of his 3 wishes. And so I want to pretend for just a moment. This is the joy of being a dad with 3 younger kids. We play pretend a lot, and so I want us to all just kind of pretend, think that you're a child or maybe an adult right now, and let's pretend for a moment that you're Aladdin, that you have found this magic lamp, and the most powerful being in the universe is going to grant you 3 wishes. All right. Now we're going to play by the same rules that Aladdin had to play by. All right. So your 3 wishes cannot be for more wishes. They cannot be for someone to fall in love, and they cannot be for someone to come back from the dead. But everything else is on the table. Anything that you can imagine is fair game. So just think for a moment. If you had those wishes, if this was you, what would it be? Right? So think about that. I can already read some of your mind and some of your faces, and I've read some of your Facebook posts. Some of you would wish for a 2020 do-over. Like you just wish this year would start over in January and we could redo it. And some of you are honestly wishing for a 2020 deletion. Like you would just wish the calendar went from 2019 to 2021. And I completely understand either one of those wishes. For some of you, you may be wishing to improve your financial situation or pay off debt or for this or for that. But what would it be that you would wish for? If you had these 3 wishes, what would it be? Now, we're gonna pretend just a little bit deeper. Let's take 2 of those wishes away. Let's say that you get 1 wish. The most powerful being in the universe comes to you and says that I'm going to offer you 1 wish. 1 and only 1 wish. The most powerful being in the universe is going to give you 1 wish, and nothing is off the table for you. For just a moment, think about it. What would it be? This morning I'm going to introduce you to a guy named Solomon that some of you are familiar with. And for Solomon, this is not a fictional story. This is not a make-believe. This is not an imaginary moment. For Solomon, this was true. This was factual. This is something that happened to him. This is an actual situation. Solomon is the 3rd king of the nation of Israel. And our text this morning is in 1 Kings chapter 3. We're walking through some of these heroes of the Old Testament. And he's confronted in chapter 3 by the most powerful being in the universe, by God Himself, coming to ask him this one question. What do you want? Anything that you want, it's here. And so above everything else, Solomon asks for one thing. He says, I want wisdom. And he's seeking wisdom more than anything else because for him, he knows that he's going to get so much more if there's wisdom involved. And so we're going to hear part of Solomon's story in 1 Kings chapter 3. And so if you got your Bible, you can follow along with me. 1 Kings chapter 3, we're not going to read the whole chapter. We're going to start in verse 5 and read through verse 14. But 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 5 starts off, says, At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night. And God said, Ask, what shall I give you? And Solomon replied, You have shown great and faithful love to your servant, my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness, faithfulness, righteousness, and integrity. You have continued this great and faithful love for him by giving him a son to sit on his throne, as it is today. Lord my God, you have now made your servant king in my father's place. Yet I am just a youth with no experience in leadership. Your servant is among your people you have chosen, a people too numerous to be numbered or counted. In verse 9, So give your servant an obedient heart, to judge your people and to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? Now it pleased the Lord that Solomon had requested this. So God said to him, Because you have requested this, and did not ask for long life, or for riches for yourself, or for the death of your enemies, but you asked discernment for yourself to understand justice, I will therefore do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has never been anyone like you before and never will be again. In addition, I will give to you what you did not ask for, both riches and honor, so that no man in any kingdom will be your equal during your entire life. In verse 14, if you walk in my ways and keep my statutes and commandments, just as your father David did, I will give you long life. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you so much for today. We thank you for who you are, and God, we thank you for what all you have done for us. God, what you have done for us as individuals, what you have done for us as a church, God, what you have done for us as Christians. God, we start there. Because honestly, God, we have so taken for granted all that you have done for us. God, if we are truly honest with ourselves right now in this moment, God, we would be quick to answer this question. We would be quick to give you a full list of things that we wanted, and we wouldn't start in the right place, God. We wouldn't start with looking at all that you've done for us already. And so, God, if nothing else in this moment, make us appreciate that. God, if nothing else in this moment, let us see the value of wisdom. Wisdom that you have already given us. Wisdom that you have already shown to generations in the past. And God, I pray this morning that when we leave here different than when we came in. God, I pray that when we leave here with a heart desiring to know you more and desiring to know your plan for our lives and to follow that plan. God, I pray that we leave here seeking wisdom, not from this world, but from our Maker and our Designer and our Creator. God, I pray that we leave here seeking a plan to know you more than we did yesterday or the day before or last year. And so, God, we come to you right now, the all-knowing God, the all-powerful God, asking one thing. God, give us wisdom. Give us knowledge and give us discernment between knowing from good and from evil. And God, give us an obedient heart to hear you, Father. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Purdue Foods is the fourth largest poultry company in the country, and their headquarters is just outside of Salisbury, Maryland. I'm sure that many of you have eaten Purdue chicken or Purdue turkey or something. You're familiar with the blue label that comes with it. Most of you are familiar with that. You may have known their headquarters was in Salisbury, Maryland, and their headquarters there. They have top of the line corporate offices there, and they have this innovation center for research and development. And I don't know what all research goes on with chickens, but they've got a lot of it that's going on there in packaging and shipping and all this stuff that goes on. This is top of the line stuff. This is world class stuff that goes into the chicken that sits in your freezer section or your refrigerated section. And so they have invested tons of money in all this corporate stuff. But Jim Purdue, the CEO of Purdue Farms, he doesn't credit the company's success to any of that. He honestly believes that the success of his company actually lies not in the corporate headquarters at all. In fact, it lies across the street from the headquarters. You see, if you are sitting in the corporate office of Purdue Farms and you look across the street, you're going to see this 100-year-old farmhouse sitting across the street that looks like this. It's still there. It's been there for over 100 years. See, this is the farmhouse that Arthur Purdue lived in, and this is the farmhouse that he raised his first set of birds in when he started the company in 1920. 100 years ago, this is where the whole company started. And several years ago, there was talk about tearing the house down because the corporate headquarters needed to expand. They needed more room, and so we already own this land. Why don't we just tear this house down and build over there? And this huge family discussion happened, and after a long discussion, the family decided that they were going to leave that house because the value of that house was more important than all the land that was around it. You see, what Jim Purdue said later in an interview several years ago, he said the reason they left the house is because it's important to know where you're from, where our roots are at. The values that were started and that were taught in that house continue to shape our company to this very day. For Jim Purdue, the secret of his company's success is looking at that house. It's remembering where you come from and where you should be focused at. And so they've left that house so that everybody that comes to their corporate office passes that house and they're reminded, this is where we started and this is where we are at now. You see, sometimes the best place to start looking for and seeking wisdom is actually backwards. It's actually looking back to our past. And for Jim Purdue, it's looking across the street to this old white farmhouse. But for Solomon, it's looking back at the legacy and the kingdom that his father David had built. And looking at the legacy and kingdom that David had built up. And this quest for knowledge starts with looking back at what David had did and really looking at what God had done in and through David. So Solomon starts his quest for wisdom, his seeking after knowledge, by remembering what God had already done, not just for him, but for the generation before him. You see, in the very beginning of this conversation, this dream between God and Solomon starts in verse 5. God asks him, he says, listen, what do you want me to give you? You just ask for it. This is the genie moment. You just ask for anything that you want, and it's going to be yours. And Solomon doesn't answer right away. Instead of giving him this shopping list, which, let's be honest, most of us would be prone to do, instead of coming up with this answer of, this is what I want. I've wanted this since I was a kid. I've wanted this for my whole life. Instead of doing any of that, Solomon goes backwards. And in verse 6, he talks about what God has already done and looks back and he remembers the faithfulness of God. And Solomon starts his answer back to God when God says, what do you want? Just ask it. And in verse 6, Solomon says, you have shown great and faithful love to your servant, my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness, righteousness, and integrity. You have continued to this great and faithful love for him by giving him a son who sits on his throne as it is today. You see, before Solomon says anything, before he asks for anything, before he looks to get anything, he acknowledges what God has already done for him. He acknowledges the fact that the only reason that he is the king, the only reason that he is where he is because God has put him there. The only reason that he is the king of Israel at the time is because God put his father there, and now he's put him there. And so he is truly looking at the faithfulness of God and the faithfulness of his father. And he recognizes that when he looks back over his father's life, that every promise God made to his father came true. And so he's telling him, listen, God, before I give you what I tell you what I want you to understand that I recognize that you are true. I recognize that you are faithful, that my father left this huge legacy, that every promise you ever made came true to him, that every promise that you ever gave him, you followed through with. And so I want you to understand that when Solomon looks over God's track record and he sees how faithful God has been to his father, it adds a huge amount of weight to this promise in verse 5. Because it's ask anything, and God's going to do it because it's the promise that he makes. See, there's a huge amount of weight that's in this moment. You see, let me put it to you this way. If you came up to me today and you asked me for $100, and I said, listen, Mike, I don't have $100 today, but next time I see you, I'll have it, and I'll give it to you then. Well, let's say Mike comes back next Sunday, and he comes up to me, he's like, hey man, you got that $100 that you promised me? Well, Mike, I don't have it today, and I had to do this. Next week I'll have it. And then next week Mike comes, and he's like, hey, have you got that $100? No, I had to spend it on my dog last night, and I don't have it today. My guess is that it wouldn't take Mike many weeks coming up to me and hearing those excuses over and over and over till Mike's going to quit asking. Why? Because there's no expectation. He's realized that I'm not true, that I'm not faithful, that I'm not going to be able to fulfill this promise that I made to him. But if Mike looks back over my track record, and every time I promised him something, I came through for it. Every time I said, this is what I'm going to do, I did it. If that's Mike's track record, if that's my track record, then the moment that Mike comes up to me and says, listen, hey, can I have $100? And I say, hey, I don't have it, but next time I see you, I'll give it. Guess what he's going to expect? Next time that he's going to get that $100. This is what Solomon's doing. He's looking back over the life of David, and he's looking back over the track record of God, and he realizes at this moment there's never been a promise that God made to his father or to him, even to this point, that he didn't follow through with. And so if God promises to give him something, he's going to do it. He's going to keep this promise. And so I wonder how often we miss out on wisdom because we don't look backwards often enough. I wonder how often we miss out because we're not willing to look back at the past and to look back at past generations to see what God has been doing and working and moving in the past generations. Maybe it's a little home, but I wonder how often we have discredited the generation or the generations that came before us because, well, they just wouldn't understand. Things are different now than they used to be. that the world's not the same as it was for them. I wonder how often we've really discredited what God was doing 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 50 years ago because it was just different for them. They just wouldn't understand what we're going through. And I wonder how often we've passed up on opportunities to have wisdom because we didn't open up to the generations that were before us. Because we didn't seek out what God was doing through them. I heard a lady who was talking the other day that she had a patient of a lady that was over 100 years old. I want you to think about that for a moment. What all this lady has experienced in the last 100 years. We're sitting in 2020 worried to death about this pandemic that's sweeping the world. Do you know how many pandemics she's been through in her life? Do you know how many world wars she's been through in her life? Do you know how many depressions and recessions and booming times she's been through in her life? And we dare to think that she has no wisdom and value to what we're going through right now? I wonder how often we miss out on wisdom because we don't look backwards to the generations before us, and we don't look backwards to see what God was doing in and through those past generations that are useful for us today. I wonder how many times we don't have wisdom because we're not willing to look back at what God's been doing throughout all of history. Not just a generation or two generations before us, but thousands of years of history in this book. I wonder how often we missed out on wisdom, practical, applicable wisdom, because we didn't look back and see what God had been doing all along. You know, maybe I'm getting old. Maybe it's well, I know I'm getting old, but maybe it's that I'm getting older. I begin to realize that I'm really missing the wisdom and experience of those generations that came before me. And I've become convinced that maybe the best place to look for wisdom is not always the screen on the smartphone in front of you. It's not always on the TV screen. It's not always in the books that you have. It's not always looking forward. Sometimes your best answers, your best source of wisdom is in the generations that have come and the generations that have come before them. You see, some of the best advice you're ever going to hear in your life comes from those people who have been there, who have done that, and honestly have lived to tell the story about it. My guess is that if we look to the past, we'd start to appreciate God's faithfulness a whole lot more. That if we would do what Solomon does, that we'd see what Solomon saw, that this is setting the stage, that God has been setting the stage for this very moment for your whole life. In fact, not just your life, but generations before. Solomon comes to this point and he realizes that God has been working in the generation past and generations before that to bring him to this moment right here. And all this background that's been going on brings him to this moment. And I wonder how often we have been so foolish that we didn't look back to see what God's been doing in the generation. I wonder how foolish we have been not consider the lessons and the wisdom that He's taught our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents to bring us to this moment right here. You see, but for many of us, that's why our quest, that's why our seeking our knowledge stops. Because honestly, we're too proud to admit that we need help in the first place. We're too proud to even look for an outside source. One of my favorite things to do when I was teaching on the very first day to school was to really mess with students' heads, all right? And maybe it's a sick way to do this, but I can convince that if you're a science teacher, you do two things on the first day of class, okay? This only works for high school. If you're a science teacher, you do two things. First thing you do is you catch something on fire, okay? Because if a science teacher catches something on fire the first day of class, man, you got them for the whole semester, okay? They are intrigued, except they're going to ask you every single day what you're going to catch on fire the next day, okay? The other thing you do is you mess with their heads. You get them thinking about different things that they didn't think about before. And so the very first day, you do all those things that you have to do. You take the roll, you go through the class syllabus and the expectations, and then I would give them their first assignment, okay? And I would have it written on the board behind the projector screen. And I would raise this projector screen after I told them to get out a sheet of notebook paper. And I would say, all right, your first assignment is on the board. Go ahead and get started on it. And so on the board, before they got to class and hidden behind the projector screen, I had written just a short paragraph. And the short paragraph basically told them who I was and welcome to class. And I'm excited that you're here. We're going to have a great semester together. That was all it said. Except it said it in German. And the very first line of what I had written said the instructions to translate the following paragraph. And so I told them after I revealed this first assignment, my job was just to step back and watch. And so I did this every year. I loved it. Like, it was kind of fun. This was the sick way of teaching. I understand this. But I would pull this thing up and I'd say, all right, get your sheet of paper out. Let's get started. This is your first assignment. I'd pull that thing up and then I would walk back over to my desk and I would just stand there and watch. And I would start to read my students from that moment on. And so I would watch some of them give up within seconds, just like, this is crazy. This makes no sense to me whatsoever. And then I would watch other students try to form their own kind of subgroup over here, and they were going to figure this thing out. They were going to work this thing out. And then I would hear other students over here, they would try to rationalize this thing out, and they would think out loud, and they would start talking kind of with each other all the way across the room and be like, well, that looks like Rakes. That's his last name. We think that's his last name. He didn't really tell us. Maybe it's not. And so they're trying to figure out what this paragraph says. And so finally, after watching them either give up or struggle or fight with each other for a little bit of time, I said, all right, that's it. If you'll go ahead and put your name on your paper, go ahead and pass to the front. This will be your first assignment. And you can imagine if you've got a class full of teenagers, they didn't like that too much. Especially smart teenagers that are used to making A's, okay? Man, they started protesting. Man, this isn't fair. This isn't right. You can't do this. This isn't fair at all. And so I usually followed up with, well, what's not fair about it? The instructions were very clear to you. It told you exactly what to do on the board. Well, it's not fair. You didn't do anything. I didn't need to. The instructions were there. Well, it's not fair. You didn't help us in any way. And I said, well, that's exactly the point of this whole thing. You all started this assignment, and I walked over to my desk, and you either gave up, you struggled, or you tried to work with other people. But you know what none of you did in this class? None of you ever came to me and said, Mr. Rakes, I don't understand what's going on. Mr. Rakes, I don't understand. Mr. Rakes, I need help with this. You see, if anybody knew what was expected of this class, it was the person who gave the assignment. If anybody knew what was supposed to be happening in that classroom, it was the one who wrote the stuff on the board. But guess what? None of you asked for help. And so it led to this great discussion for them and for me is, listen, the only way I'm going to know that you don't understand what's going on in this class is if you're willing to ask for help. And if you don't ask for help, I'm going to assume that you're on the same train that I am. And even though what I just said and what you just read makes as much sense as the German that's on this board right now, I don't know that unless you tell me that. I don't know that unless you ask for help and say, I don't understand this. So I'm going to assume that you're on the same train that I am, and we're just going to keep rolling right through the task, and we're going to get deeper and deeper in this subject, and I'm going to leave you at Station A or Station 1 if you don't ask for help before we move on to Station 2. So we had this great conversation that sometimes the best way to seek wisdom and the best way to gain wisdom is to admit that we don't have all the answers in the first place. To admit that we really do need help when the task is too big for us. You see, that's the second lesson that Solomon teaches us in this story, that wisdom comes when we're really humble enough to know that we're really not up to this task to start with. The wisdom comes when we are humble enough to say we need help. And so in verse 7, after remembering God's faithfulness to David and his father, Solomon says in verse 7, Lord my God, you have now made your servant king in my father David's place. And yet I am just a youth with no experience in leadership. David was a great king, and he did lots of great things for Israel. And now David has passed on, and now it's up to Solomon. Now, Solomon is the king, and so Solomon comes to this task, and he admits two things right away. He says, I'm young. Now, we don't know how young is to Solomon at this time. People speculate he's anywhere between 12 and 20 at this time. I've been 12, and I've been 20, and I can't imagine being the king of a country at either one of those ages. All right? I'm in my late 30s now, and I still can't imagine being the king of a country at this point in my life. All right? I'm having a hard enough time with the king of my 3 kids, much less the whole nation. And he says, listen, God, I'm young and I'm inexperienced in this. I don't know. I may have been the son of a mighty king, but that's very different than being the king itself. I may have been the son and lived in this palace or around this great king, but I wasn't king. It's very different when you're the one in charge. And God, I don't have the experience it takes. I don't have this leadership to make these people follow me. And by the way, this is not just a few people. We're not talking a small group of 10 or 20 people. In verse 8, he goes on to say that his servant is among the people whom you've chosen, people too numerous to be numbered or counted. God, this is big. This is a really big task. There are a lot of people, and I don't want to mess this up for them. But even more important, you've chosen these people. And so to mess this up for them is really to disappoint you. And God, I don't want to do that. And so, God, I'm young. And I don't have the experience what it takes to lead these people. And God, I know you chose me, but I'm really questioning why you did that. I don't know if you've ever felt that way, but I can tell you that I have. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where it seems too big for you. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation that you really feel that you're not prepared for, that you really don't have the experience it takes to do what God has called you to do or leading you to. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where that you don't know what the next step is. I can imagine that if you're a parent, either in this room or watching online, you know that feeling. Because you took that little baby home with you for the first day and you looked at him or her and said, I don't know what happens next. At the hospital, there were all these people there that did this for me, and now I'm on my own. God, this is too big for me, even though it's only this big. This is too big for me. And so I don't know if you've ever had those moments where you feel completely unprepared for it. But I'm convinced that, one, you're not alone, but I'm also convinced that sometimes God puts you in a situation that you're unprepared for, because even though you're unprepared for it, He's not. Even though you feel completely inadequate for it, He's completely adequate for it. Sometimes He does this to teach us that we need to stop and ask for help. And sometimes we need to be less dependent on ourselves and more dependent on Him, because, let's be honest, the task is too big for us. But we're never going to come to a place where we gain more wisdom if we're not willing to admit that. The truth is that we're never going to gain more wisdom than we have right now if we think we already have all the wisdom that we need. The hardest students to teach, the hardest people to coach are the know-it-alls. The ones that think they have all the answers. And so in those moments when we don't feel that we know enough, in those moments that we feel like it's too big for us, that we feel like we're unprepared for us, those are the moments that God's going to reveal the most to you. Those are the moments that God's going to give you the most wisdom and the most knowledge. Those are the moments that we're going to learn and we're going to grow more than any other time, because we came to a task that was too big for us, but nowhere near too big for God. And we became less of ourselves and more dependent on Him. You see, the moment that we find wisdom is the moment that we find out that He is all about Him and not about us in the first place. See, this is where Solomon finds it. It's in this moment, this season of life that's way too big for him. And that's exactly the reason that that Solomon asked for what he asked for. That's the reason that he asked for wisdom, because there's a bigger purpose than himself. And Solomon has come to realize this. Even though he's young, even though he's inexperienced, he comes to this greater purpose of seeking wisdom. And so in verse 9, he finally gets to answering God's question of, hey, what is it? What do you want from me? And in verse 9, Solomon finally comes to him and says, so give your servant an obedient heart to judge your people and discern between good and evil. And for who is able to judge this great people of yours? See, the one thing that Solomon asked God for was an obedient heart. And the Hebrew literally means a listening or an understanding heart. Right? A heart that's able to listen and understand, to make right decisions. You see, what Solomon is really asking for is he wants to be the smartest guy in the room. He wants to be wise above everybody else. But he doesn't want it so that he can brag that he's the smartest guy in the room. He doesn't want it so that everybody's impressed with him or everybody is coming to him. That's not what he wants this for. Do you see? He's asking for an obedient heart. And what it says in that verse, give your servant an obedient heart to judge your people and to discern between good and evil. You see, he's not asking this to ace his college exams or to brag about a friend. The reason that Solomon is seeking wisdom is because he wants to be able to listen to a case. He wants to be able to listen to a dispute between two people and know which one is right. He's asking God for wisdom so that He's a better judge of the people and that He can lead them in the right direction. And honestly, he's asking God to give him something that will make him better able to do what God's already called him to do in the first place. You see, a king's job is to lead people. A king's job is to be the one that makes a decision. And so I want you to imagine for just a moment that you have a king or you have a president or a congressman, whatever you want to put in that position, and they reach this crossroads. There's this major decision that has to be made, and they just stand there. They just stand there. They don't go this way. They don't go that way because they just can't figure out which way is right. And I won't get political here for just a moment, but it cracks me up when we vote people in office and they vote and they just vote that they're present. I'm just here. Just breathing air and taking up space. That's all I'm here. I'm here. They won't make a decision one way or the other, and I know there's all kinds of political reasons for that, and we won't get into that. But listen, if you have a leader and their job is to lead, and you come to a crossroads where the road is either right or left, and they just stand in the middle, guess what? They're not leading you anywhere. There's nowhere to follow. You can't follow them because they're not moving, and so what do? You're just stuck. And so Solomon is standing in this place and he says, God, I want to come to a crossroads and I want to know, do I go right or do I go left? Because these people behind me are counting on me. They're depending on me. And so if I don't move, if I don't go in the right direction, they're not going to go in the right direction either. And so God, give me wisdom, give me a discerning and obedient heart so that I can do better what you called me to do. He's asking for wisdom so that God can use him in a greater way. He's asking for wisdom so that God would be able to use him in a way that glorifies God even more. And so for you guys that were here last week, or you guys that watched last week, this is a beautiful mirror of Hannah that we talked about last week. The thing that she wanted most in her life was a child. But she doesn't ask for a child so that she can show it off. She doesn't ask for a child so that she can gloat about it. She asks for a child so that she can give that child back to God, and that God can do great things through that child. And Solomon has the same picture here. He's asking for wisdom so that God can do wonderful and great things with him, so that he can be the leader that God's called him to be. And so we started out asking this question this morning. If the most powerful being in the universe came to you and said, you have one wish, what would it be? We started out with that question, but maybe the better question is not what would it be, but why would you ask for that? See, I think that's the lesson that Solomon is teaching us. Why is that the desire of your heart? Out of all things that you can ask for, why is that what you're asking for? The lesson that Solomon has for us is maybe not what you ask for is as important as why you're asking for it. You see, the wisdom that he's asking for isn't for his glory, it's for God's glory. It's to be a better servant. A little further down in this chapter, we didn't read this part, but there's this case. In fact, not too long after, there's this case that comes before Solomon. Some of you are familiar with this case. But this case is two women who are living in the same house. They both have children just a few days apart, and so they both have newborns or infants in the house, and they're sleeping there in the house with their children. And one of the children dies in the middle of the night. And so one of the ladies who wakes up with the dead child accuses the other mother of switching the babies in the middle of the night. And then the other one's like, no, this is my child. This is the one I woke up with. This is my child. Now, there's no witnesses. There's no DNA testing in those days. There's no Maury Povich to be like, you're the father. No, you're the mother. There's none of that, okay? And so you have no witnesses, and you've got to figure out which child this is. And you're like, oh, well, that's easy. You just look at them and you know. No, you don't. I love my kids, but they changed who they look like 15 times before we ever got them out of the hospital. In fact, they changed colors 15 times before we got out of the delivery room. All right? You're looking at a newborn baby and you're trying to figure out which mother it belongs to. It's not as easy as you think. And so Solomon, this case is brought to Solomon and he's got to figure this out. And so he uses the wisdom that God gave him to discern between these two. He devises this great test, and many of you are familiar with this story. He devises this great test with all this arguing and going on between these two women. He says, bring me a sword. Oh, what's the king need a sword for? We're just talking about a baby here. And he says, we're going to cut this child in half. And so since you can't decide who he belongs to, you get half and you get the other half. Sounds like a great solution. Now, we do this all the time at our house, all right? Except not with babies. Let's just be clear, all right? But this is the idea that we can't decide this case, so you're going to get half and you're going to get half. And all of a sudden, the mother who that child really belongs to steps up and is like, whoa, no. I'd rather my child live with her than be dead with me. And automatically, Solomon knows that's the real mom. Because the other lady doesn't care. She's already lost her child, so what's another dead baby to her? And so Solomon knows in that moment, using the wisdom that God had given him, this is the true answer. This is the discerning between good and evil. This is the discernment that he was seeking after. And so at the end of that verse, at the end of that story, in verse 28, we get the end of it. And Solomon had been asking to determine right from wrong, and he does it. And the very last part of that story, in verse 28 of this chapter, it says, all of Israel heard about the judgment that the king had given, and they stood in awe of the king. Now, if the verse ended there, we would be impressed with Solomon. But it doesn't end there, okay? Let me read the whole thing. All of Israel heard about the judgment that the king had given, and they stood in awe of the king, because they saw that God's wisdom was in him to carry out justice. You see, the people were there and they were in awe of the king, but they weren't just in awe of the king because he's the king. They're in awe of the fact that God's wisdom is in him. They're impressed with the king, but they're really impressed that God gave him this wisdom. They're impressed with the wisdom of God working through Solomon. So the greater purpose of this wisdom, or whatever we're asking God for, is not to leave people in awe and impressed with you. It's to leave people in awe and impressed with the God who gave it to you in the first place. And so we ask that question again. It's not really what you would ask God for, But why is that the desire of your heart? Is it to build up His kingdom or to build up yours? You see, in this, you might remember in the clip that we watched from Aladdin that we started with this morning, the genie is shocked that Aladdin doesn't know what he wants. He doesn't know what to wish for. And he says usually by the time somebody finds the lamp, they've already got their wishes made out and they're ready for it. And usually it involves an unlimited supply of money and unlimited power. And then he tells him this morning, he says that you don't want to drink from those cups. You see, apparently these were pretty common wishes, and Solomon could have asked for these things as well. In fact, verse 11 almost gives the impression that God's kind of surprised that Solomon doesn't ask for these things. Not that God is surprised, but He knows this is human nature. This is what normally people would ask for. And so then in verse 11, God notes that you didn't ask for long life. You didn't ask for riches for yourself. That's the wealthy part, the unlimited money. You didn't ask for the death of your enemies. That's the unlimited power part, because if all your enemies die, then there's no one else left. You're the one in charge. Okay? So he could have asked for these things. So human nature says that this is what we ask for. We ask for things that benefit us. But he asked for wisdom, and his request pleases God so much that God makes him another promise. And the promise is this, that I'm going to give you wisdom, but I'm going to give you the benefits that come with that wisdom as well. You see, there's a huge amount of benefits that come with the wisdom that he's going to get. And there's this pretty impressive set of bonuses. In verse 12, God says to Solomon that He's going to give him the wise and understanding heart that he asked for. But he's going to get these benefits that come with it. In verse 13, God said to Solomon, in addition, isn't that an awesome... We can just stop right there. In addition. I don't know about you, but how many times have you been praying for one thing and God gives you in addition? That God gives you far more than you ever even thought to ask for. Exceedingly abundant of what you thought of. And so in addition, we're so thankful that God does more than we ask for. I will give you what you didn't ask for both riches and honor, so that no man in any kingdom will ever be your equal during your entire life. Did you hear those two benefits of wisdom? Listen here. Riches and honor. Solomon didn't ask to be rich, but he's going to be rich because it's a benefit of wisdom. He didn't ask to have honor or a great reputation or glory, but he's going to get it because it's a benefit of the wisdom that he has asked for. And so you're sitting there, you're trying to connect these two. How do riches and honor fit with wisdom? Let me give it to you this way. If you go to IKEA or you go to Walmart, or you go to some place that sells furniture in a box that you have to put together, okay? You know what I'm talking about, the bookshelves or whatever it is that you're going to buy. And there's a picture on the box or somewhere of what this desk, we're going to picture a desk, that this desk is supposed to look like. All right, everybody got this in your mind? There's this picture, this is the end game, this is what we're going for, this is what you bought, okay? But when you get home, you open that box to find out that you really didn't buy a desk. What you bought was a 1,000-piece 3D jigsaw puzzle, okay? Some of you know what I'm talking about because you've been there and you've done that. And so when you open that box and there's these 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle laid out everywhere, you have two choices at that moment. Okay? And some of you, this is not a judgment place. This is a free zone. Okay? Where everybody's safe here. All right? So we're not going to pick camps. Don't nudge your husbands or wives at this point. But you got two choices. When you got 1,000 pieces laying out, you either just start guessing where things go and just start putting things together, or you open up that little booklet that comes with that 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. Okay? And again, don't nudge your husband. I saw some of that. All right? But if you start guessing this 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, you may get lucky and it end up looking like the desk is supposed to look. Okay? But you may also end up with a desk that looks like it's supposed to, but a bag of extra parts at the end, and maybe it's even not stable enough to hold anything like a book or a pencil, that when you put it on, the whole thing collapses. That may be where you end up. And so when you just start guessing, you don't know where you're going to end up. You think you do, but you don't know. But the other choice is that you go to this little booklet that comes in that 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, and you start on page 1 with the directions, because those directions and instructions, you know what? They were given to you for a reason. They were given to you so that you had a plan to follow through, so that you started here and ended with a desk. And guess what? They weren't written just by anybody. They were written by the designer and creator of that furniture. The person or company that made that furniture made this guide to go along with it, so that you started here and you ended here. So that when you ended, you had this beautiful desk that looks like it does on the box, and you don't have all the extra parts that you needed somewhere else. But I want to tell you that this doesn't just work with furniture. The same is true when you get a paycheck. Every week or every 2 weeks or every month or however often you get paid, you hold that paycheck in your hand and you got two choices in that moment. Am I just going to willy-nilly guess at how to spend and where to put this money at? Or am I going to follow the instruction manual? And you're like, whoa, there's an instruction manual that comes with my paycheck? Yeah, there is. Okay? It doesn't come from your employer. It comes from the one who created money and designed the whole system to start with. It's this book that some of you are holding in your hands and is up here on this podium. There are so many verses of wisdom about how to spend your paycheck and what to do with your paycheck that won't just get you through the next paycheck. Guess what it'll do? It will build your wealth. It will build your wisdom, and you'll start to gain riches in ways that you never thought you could before. Whoa, Michael, you're telling me that if I start reading this Bible and following this Bible, I'm going to get a massive new paycheck? No. I'm telling you that you're going to use the resources that God gave you in the way that He designed and He planned for you to use it. But it's not just paychecks. It happens with kids. You got that little bitty baby in your arms and maybe that teenager at your home, and you got two choices. You can either guess and hope that you're raising them right, or you can do it by the plan of the one who designed them and created them. You can do it by the instructions and the wisdom that He gave to you. You can do it with everything. You're trying to work to build your reputation, an honorable reputation. You can go through each day guessing that what you're doing is right in each situation, that this is right and that's right and this is right. Or you can go with the one who designed your day and created your day and created you and knows everything about you, and follow the wisdom that He put you in for this moment. You see, we seek wisdom, and it's not just useless information. We have this whole book of generations past of wisdom for us to live by. In fact, there's a whole book in this book that's just wisdom. It's called Proverbs. And there's so much wisdom in there that if we would follow that instruction plan, God's plan, then we will receive the benefits of it, that He, the designer and creator, we end up where we're supposed to be because we followed the instructions and the wisdom that was already given to us. But I want to leave you with one last lesson from the life of Solomon, and it's simply this. Once you got what you asked for, don't forget about the giver who gave it to you. You see, one commentator wrote this. He wrote that Solomon is probably the most disappointing person in the entire Bible. Solomon had so much, but he missed what was most important. You see, Solomon was a king, and he went on to build this beautiful temple. He went on to build this beautiful palace, and man, he was the great king at the time. He rivaled all the other kings in the world, and he expanded the kingdom not just physically, but in the way of influence. He had peace treaties and trade agreements with these nations all over parts of the world. In fact, other kings and queens heard so much about Solomon, they came and traveled for months just to see if all they heard was true. They came for months just to sit and listen to the wisdom. These aren't just lay people. These aren't just servants. These are kings and kings of other nations are coming to him to listen to advice, to hear this great wealth of knowledge. He wrote over 3,000 proverbs and over 1,000 songs. See, God is faithful to give Solomon exactly what He promised. Solomon asked for wisdom, and God gave it to him. He is faithful to give him what he asked for. But Solomon wasn't faithful to him. You see, if we flip over a few chapters to chapter 11, Solomon is now an old man. He's had all this experience and all this great stuff that God has given to him, all the wisdom that he wanted, and plus all the extra benefits. And then we get to chapter 11, and verse 4 of chapter 11 says, when Solomon was old, his wives seduced him, and he followed other gods. He was not completely devoted to Yahweh his God as his father David had been. In verse 6 it goes on to say that he actually did evil in the sight of God, in the sight of the Lord. And so all this wisdom that he had, he forgot the most important thing. He forgot the one who gave him the wisdom in the first place. He enjoyed all the wisdom. He enjoyed all the wealth. He enjoyed all the honor and glory that God had given him, all the benefits that came with the wisdom he sought after. And he built himself up instead of pointing others to God. And so these 300 wives and 700 concubines that he had, they pulled him away from the one thing that he should have been anchored on in the first place. And so for some of us, this is where we need to camp out in this sermon, because we honestly don't need to be spending time asking for more things. We honestly don't need to be spending time of thinking, if God was going to give me one thing, what would it be? We don't need to think about what God would give us, because we need to look back and see what we're doing with what He's already given us. You see, we sit in this room and there's people watching online that God has given us a vast array of talents and abilities. Some of you are the smartest people in the room. At any time, at any place, you are it. You are the smartest person in the room. All right? Some of you, that's you. For some of you, you've been given the gift of music. For some of you, you've been given athletic abilities. For some of you, you've been given the gift to teach. For some of you, you've been having this ability to build and construct things in a way that nobody else can. Now, all this comes down to the question of what are you doing with what God has given you? You see, Solomon was given all these great abilities and all this great knowledge and all this great stuff. And at the end, what did he do? He turned his back on the one who gave it to him. So the question is, what are we doing with the abilities, with the talents, with the gifts that God has already given to us? Are we using them for His glory, or are we using them for ours? Are we using them to serve others or to serve ourselves? Are we praying that God will keep giving you talents and abilities even though you're not using the ones that He's given you right now? How many times have we looked at somebody kind of in jealousy and be like, man, if I could sing like that person, I'd be on stage every Sunday. That's what I do all the time. All right, I'm just going to be honest with you. If I could play an instrument like these folks, or if I could sing like these folks, I'd be on this stage every Sunday. But that's not what God gifted me and gave me ability to do. Okay? But He gave me other abilities and talents to use that sometimes I'm overlooking because I'm looking for something else. And so sometimes the wisdom of Solomon looks back and says, what are you doing with what God has given you? Quit asking for other stuff and start using the things that God has given you for His glory, to build up His kingdom. And so all the wisdom, all the wealth, all the power. And yet Solomon loses his dependence on God. He forgot the giver. And so for every gift, every talent that you have, it's a gift from Him to be used by Him for Him. Don't forget the giver. Let's pray together.